Dear colleagues, I again would like to thank you for being here, for your interest, and for choosing to spend your afternoon with us rather than enjoying the beautiful April sunshine and warmth, especially after the 3 weeks of rain that we had earlier in our area. And I am delighted to welcome and introduce our final presenter for the conference, Austin Charron, who is part of an extraordinary group of doctoral students at KU, graduate program in geography and atmospheric science, who are doing research on Ukraine. We are tremendously lucky and honored and proud to have such an extraordinary community of young scholars working on this country, which has been in the crucial node of so many problems and issues impacting global security in recent years. And Austin in particular is now a really outstanding specialist, and I would say, I'm not exaggerating, one of the leading specialists on what is one of the crucial topics that is affecting it, and that is the consequence of annexation, Russia's annexation of Crimea, and what were its impact on the questions of population displacement and what may be both short-term and long-term consequences of that. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Austin Charron.
Well, thank you, Vitaly, for the very flattering introduction. I hope I'll live up to it. Thank you all for joining me, for sticking it out to the end of the conference here with me. The title of my presentation is Crimeans in Mainland Ukraine, Displacement and Identity After Annexation. This is work that I'm currently engaged with for my dissertation, with funding from the National Science Foundation, actually the Arctic Social Science Program, specifically within the National Science Foundation. It's a bit of a long story why I ended up doing work in Ukraine with funding from the Arctic Social Sciences Program, but I'll spare you the boring details for now. But I want to give some brief background on some of the images you see here. These are all taken from the May 18th commemoration of the day of deportation of the Crimean Tatars. This from last year, May 18th, 2016, in Kiev, where I did much of my field work. And we see both Crimean Tatars, young Crimean Tatar boys wrapped in the Crimean Tatar national flag, but also, as we see on these shirts, Crimean Ukrainians wrapped in the Ukrainian flag, and people holding a banner here that says, Ukrainians and Crimeans, one state, one Maidan, or of course the very square where this demonstration was taking place, but where the Euromaidan demonstrations took place just a few years before. So I want to begin by providing a little bit of background on Crimea, in case, for those of you who are not familiar, particularly with this region and its history. It has a long history, but I'll begin here with the Crimean Khanate, a period that began in 1449. That was a time when the various peoples who had settled in Crimea over millennia, long before, began to coalesce as a cohesive ethnic community that became known as the Crimean Tatars, under the leadership of descendants of the Golden Horde, themselves descendants of the Mongol Empire, and sort of Mongolic Turkic peoples who could become Muslims, beginning to be the leaders of this new community that took place there. Crimea was annexed for the first time by the Russian Empire in 1783. It was beginning at that time that many ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, other Slavic peoples, began to relocate to Crimea, beginning to displace the Crimean Tatar community, many of them beginning to flee from Crimea for other parts of the Ottoman Empire, which it was a part of before the Russian annexation, leading to large diaspora communities still now in Turkey and Romania, for example. And this accelerated, especially after the Crimean War of the 1850s. Jumping well ahead to the Soviet period, it was in 1944, the fateful year that the Crimean Tatars were deported en masse from Crimea, following the Soviet Army's recapturing of Crimea from its occupation by the German Army. After recapturing Crimea, Stalin had accused all the Crimean Tatars of collaborating with the German occupiers there, and in punishment, rounded them all up over the course of one night and shipped them off mainly to Central Asia, to other parts of the Soviet Union, something like 40% dying in the process and in the immediate years following their deportation. In their absence, 10 years later, Crimea was transferred from what was then the Russian part of the Soviet Union to the Ukrainian part of the Soviet Union, which at the time was rather inconsequential, didn't mean much for day-to-day lives. It just meant the chain of command now went through Kiev rather than directly to Moscow. And it wasn't until the late 1980s, the very end of the Soviet period, when the Crimean Tatars first began to return, and that continued in much larger numbers in the first few years of the Ukrainian independence after 1991. So we see here some artistic depiction of the deportation of the Crimean Tatars, and the types of homes that the Crimean Tatars came back to and had to begin living in when they did return from Crimea, to find that their former homes and lands were occupied now by Russians, Ukrainians, and others, and they were left with having to basically build small shacks on vacant land in the hopes of being able to lay claim to it eventually. As of the last census of Ukraine of 2001, so it's rather out of date, and so these numbers may have changed quite a bit. Crimea's population was 60% Russian, making it the only region of Ukraine with a Russian ethnic majority. About 25% ethnically Ukrainian, 12% Crimean Tatar, and other minority groups there, making about 3%. So in the recent years since Ukrainian independence, since Crimea became a part of independent Ukraine, there have been some important political trends. Ethnic Russians there, by and large, have been chagrined, if you will, by the fact that they have become part of Ukraine rather than Russia in the breakup of the Soviet Union. There was a lot of rumblings of perhaps a separatist situation happening in Crimea among the ethnic Russian population in the early 90s, and that was more or less put to rest for a while, as it were, by the mid-90s with the agreement of an autonomous status for Crimea within Ukraine. But many ethnic Russians have maintained a very pro-Russian view, as has come to bear again more recently. This is an image I took in 2009 at a pro-Russian, or a demonstration for a very pro-Russian political candidate Natalia Vitrenko, with signs like Sevastopol will not be a base for NATO soldiers, right? This fear that NATO and Western military types will be invading here. Ukraine moves further west. Of course, you see the image of Stalin being waved there. So still this undercurrent of very pro-Soviet, I'd say more than pro-Russian feelings happening in Crimea. But at the same time, you've got the returning Crimean Tatars who have made it a big point to emphasize their connection to Crimea, and also making a point of broadcasting the injustice that they suffered under the Soviet regime. And this is an image from a May 18th demonstration in I don't know which year exactly, not my own photo, but their commemoration of the day of deportation in Simferopol, the capital of Crimea, where they filled the main square and made a big show of support for each other and for bringing attention to their cause. But also, in recent years, something that I think has been not very well reported on, or has flown under the radar in most cases, is the fact that Crimean Tatars have been very quick to embrace Ukraine as their new state, as their new home. Despite the fact that they had never lived to the control of Kiev any time before this. When they left Crimea, it was still part of the Russian part of the Soviet Union. Crimea had never been controlled directly from Kiev or any other part of Ukraine before that. So it's rather remarkable that when they arrived to Ukraine for the first time, really, they were very quick to embrace it as their new home, their new country of citizenship, and have been very strong supporters of the Ukrainian state, and especially its sovereignty over Crimea, since their return in the late 80s and 90s. And here we see them marching with a banner that says, "Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians are brothers." Right? I want to highlight some previous work I've done in Crimea before the annexation, when I was able to actually do field work there. In 2011, I did, for my master's thesis, I did a survey on questions of identity, and regional identity specifically. And one of the elements of this survey was to ask participants to draw a map of their homeland. Say, what do you consider your homeland? And remarkably, we found that a plurality of both Russians and Ukrainians, but an outright, very clear majority of Crimean Tatars said that, you know what, Crimea is my homeland, more so than the state of Ukraine itself, although we do see large numbers of Ukrainians indicating that as well, and even many Russians. But there's a clear sense of attachment to Crimea, not only among Crimean Tatars, but other ethnic groups there too. Ethnic regional identity is very, very strong, and I have just a few examples of those who drew Crimea, but of course we have Ukraine. And this one says Russia with Crimea and Sevastopol, a Ruski and Rossiyski город, so a city. So Russian in the sense of being ethnically Russian and pertaining to the Russian Federation, the Russian state. So some clear differences in where they see Crimea located within these big geopolitical questions, but I want to reemphasize a very strong attachment to Crimea itself. I also want to really quickly summarize the events of 2013, 2014, and what led up to the new IDP crisis in Ukraine. Of course, we had the Euromaidan demonstrations sparked by then President Yanukovych's decision not to sign an association agreement with the European Union, sparking many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to come out on the Maidan Nезалежности, the independent square in Kiev, to come out and show their support for Ukraine moving closer to Europe in protest of the decision of Yanukovych. And of course, as we all know, this snowballed into rather tragic events towards the end of the demonstrations in February of 2014, but ultimately ending with the ousting of Yanukovych and a brief moment of celebration for the protest before tragedy then befell Crimea. It was only on February 26th, just after the Euromaidan ended, that there was a large clash between primarily very pro-Ukrainian Crimean Tatars with very pro-Russian local Crimeans in front of the Crimean Parliament building. And it was just later that night into the next day, February 27th, when these so-called little green men appeared in Crimea. Military figures without insignia, no indication where they're from, but it was clear from the very start to most that they were Russian, and later confirmed by Putin himself after denying it. But they swooped in, took control of the Ukrainian parliament and other governmental and military institutions there. And the new leadership that they installed declared a referendum for March 16th on Crimea's status, whether it should join Russia or reinstate an obscure early 90s constitution that would basically guarantee Crimea the right to unilaterally declare its independence. So it was basically, join Russia now or join Russia later. And it was only 2 days later, after a, not surprisingly, resounding official result showing support for joining Russia from that referendum that has been challenged by many. It was only 2 days later that Russia formally annexed Crimea. And it was shortly thereafter that things began to heat up in eastern Ukraine too. May 11th, the referendum on independence on Donetsk and Lugansk, two separate referenda, not for joining Russia, but for becoming independent. And of course, this led to the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. So a bit of background. And this has led to the current crisis of Ukraine's internally displaced peoples, or IDPs. Now, there are certainly, I want to point out, there are way more IDPs coming from the Donbass, as Dr. Dubovic has illustrated and talked about in his previous presentation. Currently, as of June 2016, the last date I have semi-reliable numbers for, there are around 1.7 million registered IDPs from Crimea and eastern Ukraine together living in Ukraine. But of those, it's only about 20,000 that come from Crimea. So we're talking about a very small segment overall of the IDP population. But keep in mind that this 20,000 figure represents only those who have officially registered as IDPs. There are many who come from Crimea, and as we'll see, they tend to be better educated, a little more affluent, have better means. They choose not to register as IDPs. To them, many of them, they see it as, I'm moving from one part of my country to another. I'm not forced out by violence or anything like this, so I don't consider myself an IDP. So there are some activists who claim that there's as many as 100,000 IDPs from Crimea living in the Ukrainian mainland today, although it's very difficult to discern what a more accurate number is. And as has been mentioned, IDPs from the Donbass have really been forced out of their homes because of the conflict happening there, because many of their homes and cities and neighborhoods have been destroyed. There's a real threat of violence. There's a real pretty nasty regime that's taken power in parts of eastern Ukraine now that has forced people out against their better wishes, I suppose. And so there's a real contrast between those and those who have come from Crimea, who have largely done so voluntarily. There is no violence in Crimea. It's possible to live and just keep your head down and go about your daily business in Crimea in a way that is no longer possible for many from the Donbass. So there is a real disparity here in the causes of those who have left for mainland Ukraine between Crimea and the Donbass. Here's a map from now over a year ago, though, that shows where IDPs have gone within Crimea, or within Ukraine, excuse me. And you can see that in the areas of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts that are not occupied by rebels there, we see the largest concentration. So there are many who simply crossed the border and are now living in camps and communities and in cities in the neighboring regions without having to move too much further within Ukraine. But we do see populations of IDPs in every region of Ukraine. Smaller numbers in Western Ukraine, certainly, but a large concentration in the capital, in Kiev. And again, this reflects all IDPs, not just those from Crimea, who again are a very small segment of this. But I will say that among the Crimean IDPs, many of them have gone to Kiev and Lviv, in fact, as have sort of been the two primary destinations for the Crimean IDPs. And I'll be talking about that a little more. And I want to point out the fate of Crimean Tatars specifically within occupied Crimea now. They have become major victims of repressive measures by the Russian occupiers there. Their national body, representative body, the Mejlis, fronted by Rafat Chubarov here, formerly by Mustafa Dzhemilev, de facto leader of the Crimean Tatar people. Both of them have been banned from Russian territory, which includes Crimea in this case. So they are both now in exile in Kiev, among others who associated with the Mejlis who are banned from Crimea. The Mejlis has been declared an extremist organization and is forbidden from doing its business on Russian territory as they see it. There have been numerous random searches of Crimean Tatar homes and neighborhoods in search of extremist literature or anything, other kind of trumped up charges of potential terrorism or whatnot. Here's an image of a search going on in a Crimean Tatar neighborhood, I believe, in Bakhchisarai. Others have been Crimean Tatars have been abducted, arrested, or found murdered, as in the case of one, Rashat Amietov here, whose body was found on the very day of the Crimean referendum. His body found murdered with signs of torture, and he's become a big sort of cause célèbre in bringing attention to the injustices that the Crimean Tatars are suffering now. And the Ukrainian government has not done a great job so far of providing services, financial, logistical, legal services and assistance to IDPs who are coming either from Crimea or the Donbass. And much of the burden, as Dr. Tupovic has mentioned, has fallen to newly founded and created NGOs, in their acronym. I want to highlight a couple here, Crimea SOS and the Krimskaya Diaspora, Crimean Diaspora, which were both founded in the immediate days and weeks after the annexation happened and before the Donbass crisis began. So that's why they have this name of Crimea associated with them, even though they serve not only Crimean IDPs, but IDPs from eastern Ukraine as well. And we have others, Donbass SOS, another that has been founded more recently, Agenda, another prominent organization headquartered in Kiev. We see here a man, not necessarily an IDP, but it's this image that works with this, receiving a small stipend. The government has provided very, very, very small, limited amounts of money, stipends to IDPs, something like $20 a month if you're employed, or $40 if you're unemployed. So, that money goes a lot further in Ukraine than it would here, but it's still beans, So much of the burden has fallen on these NGOs, and I want to highlight this word, diaspora, the Crimean diaspora, as this will play an important role here. And in fact, my discovery of this organization is really what got me going on this very topic. Because I want to ask, having done work in Crimea before, related to identity of Crimeans there, I was curious, what effect has the Euromaidan, the annexation of Crimea, and the process of internal displacement had on identities among Crimean IDPs? Moreover, do they constitute a diaspora, as the name implies from that one organization? So I want to highlight some common elements of diaspora communities. There's a number of schema that have been used to say, okay, how do we define what a diaspora is? One is a sustained relationship with an estranged homeland, real or imagined, right? There's this idea that diaspora communities are those who have been ejected from a homeland to which they truly belong, that they now exist in enclaves around the world, or maybe concentrated in one place, but that they have this continuing connection to their homeland that they've lost, and oftentimes imagine themselves returning to. Now, from my previous work with those maps, we know that many people from Crimea do consider that their homeland, even though they are still within the same state. There's a sense that they're typically ethnically cohesive, that they're formed by ethnic enclaves that have been ejected from this homeland, but still maintain their bonds of ethnicity wherever they are now located. And there's also this implication, or often a necessary aspect to this, that they be a transnational type of migrant, i.e. that they emerge through international migration, that they cross an international border before they can be called a diaspora, that if you're still within the same country, that the label of diaspora doesn't apply. There have been others who have explored communities of refugees as being diaspora and have labeled them, people who have been ejected from their home through violent conflicts or political strife and have gone, again, across international borders and become refugees, but there's a sense that those people constitute a diaspora in certain cases, so there's some precedent in that sense. But others have said that such frameworks are too homogenizing of diasporic experiences, that it doesn't account for differences of ethnicity or class or gender or people coming from different regions of a homeland of a country, right? That this is too simple, that we need to broaden our idea of what a diaspora can be. And also that we need to think of diaspora as a discourse, not simply a label, that we can think of diaspora as a means of interrogating the tension between senses of inclusion and exclusion among migrant communities, whether they're migrating internally or externally. And also this exclusively transnational conception of diaspora has been criticized, particularly by geographers, as reifying the nation state, as saying we give too much agency to the nation state, that a national boundary is given too much agency, that if we cross an international boundary, we suddenly become a new type of person, that we're not a diaspora until we cross this line. And among us political geographers, we refer to this as the territorial trap, or this idea that we rely too much on spatialities of the nation state to frame the way we talk about spatial and social phenomena. And I like this quote that sort of gets at this idea of opening up diaspora and what it can mean and how we can approach it. This diaspora can be both evoked and revoked as a response to precarity, to the fraying of norms, to the dissolving coherence of forms of national and ethnic attachment that are historically constituted but seemingly no longer produce a coherent collective consciousness. So, sort of pointing the way forward. I want to highlight my work that I did this past year for my dissertation. There's me in the field meeting with some Crimean Tatars at a newly opened Crimean Tatar restaurant in Kiev, interviewing the founder of Crimean Diaspora, actually. So I did ethnographic field work, mostly in Kiev and Lviv, in western Ukraine, from September 2015 to June 26th. This included many interviews. 79 of those were with Crimean IDPs themselves. I did a handful of focus groups and also implemented an online survey, so to get a general overview about some important questions from a number of Crimean IDPs. Now, I'm going to use some of those survey results to sort of frame who these people are. So who are the Crimean IDPs? And I want to point out that because we have no accurate information about how many there are, right? There are a lot of numbers being thrown around, that in this case, it's not possible to get a representative sample. We don't know how to represent a group that we don't really have a clear indication of what they look like and who they are. So I will make the caveat that this is not a totally scientific survey. My sampling was the snowball method done through contacts online, through social media, who then shared it with others, and tried to reach a large, as many Crimean IDPs as I could. And I feel pretty confident that I reached a lot, because there is high penetration of social media use among Ukrainians and Crimean IDPs in particular. But I have some basic numbers here. I want to point out the ethnic composition. We have many Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and ethnic Russians altogether, and minority groups as well. This is one of the most interesting results that came out of this, the education level of those who took the survey results. We have a very disproportionate number, almost 67% with some form of graduate degree. Now, there are many different types of graduate degrees within the post-Soviet education system, and this sort of lumps them all together. But post-secondary, again, what the proper term for that is, but indicating that there's a sense of that these are the elite. These are the elite of Crimea. That there's something of a brain drain happening, that some of their best and brightest are leaving Crimea for Ukraine. And also this idea that maybe we could call this group an emigre community, because there's sort of this implication with the word emigre of them being the elite who have left a conflict area. I want to highlight briefly some of the reasons people said they left Crimea. I provided some reasons that indicate if this applies to you, also give them the opportunity to stay others. But personal opposition to the occupation came out well ahead of many others, with over 70%. But fears for personal safety, persecution, lack of economic opportunities was a pretty big one. There have been many students who have left Crimea to study in Ukrainian universities because degrees issued from Crimean universities are no longer recognized outside of Russia. So if there's any hope of really continuing their education, Crimea is sort of a dead end now. To continue or open a new business. And there are those about 14%, who have been in the mainland of Ukraine since before the annexation. And so don't really fall into this category of IDPs. I want to present some quotes from my interviews showing, highlighting some of the themes that have come out of this research. So this is a quote from a friend of mine, actually. It says that in the dance of Ukrainian society, Crimean Tatars are now having a solo. So I want to highlight the role of Crimean Tatars in Ukrainian society now. And with this quote from Rafat Chubarov, from my interview with him, again, the leader of the Majlis. It says, after the tragedy that was the occupation of Crimea, Ukrainians began to better understand the Crimean Tatars. Many of the negative myths surrounding Crimean Tatars necessarily disappeared with the occupation. Before, there were many in Ukraine who believed that Crimean Tatars posed a threat to Ukraine, that they were potential separatists. Many in Ukraine thought that their relationship with Russia and Russians assured a certain Slavic unity, and that it would guarantee a peaceful future. As it turned out, it was the other way around. Those who were considered separatists emerged as the only ones who stood up and defended the territorial integrity of Ukraine, meaning the Crimean Tatars, and those who were considered brothers turned out to be the enemies, i.e. the Russians. The relationship toward Crimean Tatars and understanding of Crimean Tatars became much better. Another quote here from a young Crimean Tatar man in Kiev. I see the change in the Kiev community. The relationship to Crimean Tatars has really changed. Everyone knows about Crimean Tatars. They talk about Crimean Tatars, about IDPs from Crimea, practically all now. Many people really know that there is such an ethnic group that lives in Crimea and indigenous to Crimea. This is again an important thing that they emphasize. I'll skip this one. I want to move along a little quicker here. But I also want to point out that Crimean Tatars have now become much more active and visible in Ukrainian life and culture and politics. I have some images that demonstrate this. It's a newly opened Crimean Tatar Cultural Center, Krymsky Dom, Crimean House in Kiev, with the Ukrainian Trizub, the Ukrainian national symbol, along with the Crimean Tatar Tamga, right, their national symbol. Here's an ad leading up to the May 18th commemoration of the day of the Crimean Tatars deportation. It says, I survived a genocide, right? These are the founders of Crimean SOS, one of the primary NGOs helping IDPs, but also maintaining a very public sort of information and news campaign about issues relating to Crimea. These two have actually just published a book about Mustafa Jamilov, the leader of the Crimean Tatar people, and this one just produced a film about him too. So they're very involved in promoting their leaders and their culture. This is one of the many Crimean Tatar restaurants that has opened in Kiev and elsewhere in Ukraine. The one that I was sitting in that previous picture, actually, Musafir. These are members of the world's first and only Crimean Tatar punk band, as they like to label themselves, doing a little show at the Ukrainian Crisis Center, a place for press conferences. They had a concert in Kiev just the other night that, by all accounts, was very successful. And this is a new Crimean Tatar art salon that is open that sells Crimean Tatar crafts and other interesting things. And I also want to highlight Jamala, the winner of last year's Eurovision Song Contest, right? The Crimean Tatar singer with her song 1944 about the deportation of the Crimean Tatars, which won the contest, of course, and much to the protest of Russia, who said it was too political and that it shouldn't be allowed. But it won, and it exposed the Crimean Tatars and their plight to a European audience, really for the first time on a large scale. And this was huge to the Crimean Tatar community. This was pretty amazing to watch this all unfold during my year of field work. I have some quick quotes here about that. And the fact that Crimea is such a sensitive topic in Ukraine now, and that Ukrainians really empathize with Crimean Tatars, certainly played a role in the choice of Jamala to represent Ukraine in Eurovision. Many Ukrainians who voted for Jamala really want all of Europe to learn about the new tragedy facing the Crimean Tatars via the earlier tragedy that this song is about. And this was a quote from before she actually won the competition. This one's after. It says, in that moment when she won, Jamala really turned everything around. Not everybody even knew of the Crimean Tatar language. Part of the song is sung in the Crimean Tatar language. But she reached everybody in Europe. She told the story of her family, how the deportation happened, how it was. This was such a dark page in the history of our nation. So this real sense of pride that Ukraine has, with a really important cultural figure like this, has taken up the plight of the Crimean Tatars in a whole new way. There's a sense of both ethnic diversity, of course, it's a diverse community, but also a sense of political solidarity along with it. This is Tamila Tasheva, one of the co-founders of Crimean SOS. She says, the people who left Crimea are those who have patriotic feelings towards the Ukrainian government. And this was the main factor, not whether you are Crimean Tatar or Slavic, but whether or not you have some kind of pro-Ukrainian position. This is the main factor uniting these two subgroups of Crimean IDPs. There's a sense that those who voluntarily left were those who supported Ukraine and made a conscious decision to remain Ukrainian and support the Ukrainian government. This is a friend of mine, going back a long time from my days in Crimea. He also says that in the community of IDPs, Russians, Ukrainians, and Crimean Tatars, there should never be any discussion about differences because Russia might exploit them. Russian agents are trying to find the differences and use them. It might be religious differences, it might be linguistic differences, but they're always doing that. That's how separatism is working. And in a time of war with separatists in our homeland, there should not be any separatism in our community of IDPs. Again, expressing this real strong political solidarity. There's also the issue of what we label this group, whether IDPs or refugees. There are some who use the term bеженцы for refugees versus переселенцы, or internal migrants, the implication being one crosses an international border and the other doesn't. And this gets back to this question of diaspora. So I have another quote from Tamila Tasheva, co-founder of Crimean SOS. She says, I don't like the term Crimean refugees because IDPs are not refugees. This isn't just a word, it signifies that you've made a distinction, that Crimea is Russia and that the remaining part is Ukraine. Accordingly, those who have come from Russian Crimea would now be considered refugees because they crossed an international border. But they did not cross an international border. We do not have an international border with Crimea. To use the word refugee, or again diaspora, reifying this idea of a diaspora being necessarily transnational, this is not the correct position. It then forms an incorrect understanding among the people. People should understand that this is our territory. We are not refugees because Crimea is the territory of the Ukrainian state. You can only be a refugee if you flee to Poland, for example, and request refugee status and all the rest. So again, it's an understanding that whether it's internal or external is a real marker of distinction. And as Crimeans, particularly Crimean Tatars here, are looking to Ukraine, they also look to Europe as being strong supporters of the Euromaidan and very much in favor of closer ties with Europe. Some good quotes here. If you ask me, my homeland is Crimea, but I view Crimea as a part of Ukraine. We know that our future is with European Ukraine, calling specifically European. Same here. This is a Crimean Tatar activist, another person who's been banned from the territory of Crimea, actually. Says, average Ukrainians saw that Crimean Tatars are also ready to defend the independence of Ukraine, and that we truly see Crimea as a part of Ukraine. But along with this, we will not give up our rights, and we insist on the restoration of our rights. Yes, we say we are part of Ukraine, but along with this, we emphasize, what kind of Ukraine? We say a pro-European Ukraine, not just any Ukraine. Even once we've restored our rights, we won't stop fighting for political change in this country. So it's also a very strong sense of political engagement and pushing for more European Ukraine. Getting back to this issue of diaspora and sort of the tension between feeling included and or excluded, I have here some narratives of inclusion with this, one of my favorite interviewees, in fact. Says, above all, I'm a human. Next, I'm a resident of Drohobych, a city in western Ukraine where he's living not far from Lviv. Because every day I see the people with whom I speak, with whom I have common interests and ideas. Next, I'm a Crimean Tatar in my soul. This is how I identify. And the citizens of Drohobych see us as Crimean Tatars, but now I assert that we are also citizens of Drohobych. Drohobych has been home to Jews, Germans, Poles, and Ukrainians. Now Crimean Tatars have appeared among the citizens of Drohobych. It makes me very happy that they have accepted us into the Drohobych family. We want to do what we can to bring good to the city. And I swear, he's been living there for about a year and a half only with his family, and I met him and he took me on a little tour of Drohobych, and every other person we met knew him and had a conversation with him. He was the real man about town at Drohobych. His whole family had really become deeply integrated into the community there. It's really remarkable to see. And again, I want to move along without taking up too much more time. So along with these narratives of inclusion, we also see narratives of exclusion, people feeling that they are still different from others among whom they've settled. So for example, a young Crimean Tatar woman told me that generally we feel like we are representatives of a different culture among the population here, particularly in Lviv in western Ukraine, where she was living. A Russian woman from Sevastopol, the most Russian city of Crimea, in fact, living in Lviv as well. She says, I don't see that we will ever become like them here, because we have a different mentality, a different culture. Although it would seem that we are all Ukrainians just the same, we are from the same country, but it is totally different. And another young woman, Russian woman, from Simferopol, living in Kiev, she says that when I go to Crimea, I understand that I no longer belong there somehow. But when I come to Kiev, I understand that I'm different all the same. And she sort of feels out of place in both places, in some small ways. That I think differently, speak differently, and do things differently from the locals. So again, we see simultaneously senses of belonging to their new communities and senses of being somehow excluded and different because of their being Crimean. Are we pretty pressed for time?
Oh, yes, we should probably start moving towards wrapping up.
Okay, I'll skip over a couple bits here then and get to this part about, back to the diaspora question. And it's important to consider whether or not they themselves consider themselves a diaspora. And this is a question I asked them directly, both in my interviews and in the survey. And remarkably, it's almost an even three-way split between yes, no, and difficult to answer. Right? So there's some real ambiguity here in how they understand the term and how they see themselves. Now, I have, along with this question on the survey, I gave them the opportunity to add some comments. So I have some quick quotes from those comments from those who said, no, we are not a diaspora. Because a diaspora is a community of co-nationals beyond the borders of their own country. I'm a Ukrainian and I'm in Ukraine. There does not exist a separate Crimean, Ukrainian, or Crimean nationality that is distinguishable from non-Crimean Ukrainians. One says diaspora equals living in a different country, very much falling back to this traditional definition, and Crimea equals Ukraine. One says I don't consider myself a diaspora since I am a citizen of Ukraine in the territory of my own state, and Crimea is Ukraine. Again, these same ideas coming through. This is Emine Japad. She's now the first Deputy Minister of Information Policy of Ukraine, has achieved quite a high ranking in the Ukrainian government now, Crimean Tatar woman. She says, I think that diaspora is somewhere out of Ukraine, because still we are citizens of Ukraine, so we cannot consider ourselves diaspora here. Of course, our homeland is Crimea, but whenever we are within the territory of Ukraine, we cannot say that we are a diaspora. So diaspora is somewhere in Turkey, Romania, let's say the United States. All those Crimean Tatars living there are diaspora. But those who are here, they are citizens of Ukraine. It's almost establishing like a third category. There's those in Crimea, there are those in the diaspora, and there are those in Ukraine who are something in between. Now, there are those who said, yes, we are a diaspora. In my interviews, for example, this is a prominent journalist from Crimea, now living in Kiev, Charron. He says that when we meet another Crimean in Ukraine, in Kiev, in Zaporizhia, in any city, if I meet another Crimean, I understand that he is probably a like-minded person, that he left the peninsula because he did not accept the annexation, and I don't feel apprehensive when I begin to speak with him. For a person from Donetsk in Kiev, when he meets another person from Donetsk, he isn't necessarily a like-minded person. This is something that Dr. Dubovik touched on. We are like-minded and we are few, so we cherish our meetings with each other. We have a lot to talk about. We have a lot of nostalgic moments to discuss, things to chat about. Therefore, a diaspora format is possible because this is a diaspora of like-minded people. We aren't just united by geography, we are united by values. So it's also challenging this idea that a diaspora must be ethnically cohesive as well. And the idea that we are Crimeans, and some other quotes saying, yeah, we are a diaspora. And I'll just sort of wrap up here with another result from my survey, asking how important are the following factors to your self-identity? Oops. And we see, okay, Ukrainian citizenship, being from Crimea, living in Europe. And Crimean Tatars especially, being from Crimea is still very important. But so is their Ukrainian citizenship, living in Ukraine. And those two factors in particular are high across the board for all ethnic groups. A little bit lower for being from Ukraine from ethnic Ukrainians. But again, a sense that being Crimean and being Ukrainian and being European are all part of this sort of hierarchy of identity, where they're all sort of nested within each other. And that, again, makes it difficult to say whether or not we can really call this a diaspora. But to conclude, I'll have my few bullet points. In spite of the Russian annexation of Crimea, Crimean IDPs are reasserting their place in the Ukrainian civic nation and Crimea's place as a part of Ukraine. Crimean Tatars are now embraced and celebrated by their fellow Ukrainian citizens as never before. And in the spirit of the Euromaidan, Crimean IDPs continue to aspire to deeper European integration and couch their political identities within an explicitly European Ukraine. And finally, although many adhere to still this normative idea of a diaspora being transnational, I will assert, and now will be doing this in my dissertation, that it is a useful analytical lens for understanding this tension between these discourses of exclusion and of inclusion among Crimean IDPs for one, but also other migrant groups, whether they be internal or external. And I'll leave it at that. Sorry if I dragged that out a bit, but let's get there.
A few questions? Fascinating.
Thank you.
A lot of things I've learned from here. Well, you mentioned that a lot of Crimean Tatars go to Lviv and Kiev. And would you care to comment why? Because it's actually far.
Sure.
And I know there's a lot of people who actually stay not far, like in Kherson. Because like with Donbass people, it was mentioned several times today, and they go like next door, Kiev and Petrovsk and so on. But why would Crimean Tatars go to Kiev, Kiev and Kharkiv?
That is a great question.
And Lviv, yeah. And I have another one.
Sure.
You know, the young age of those people, it's like 38 point something?
36.8, I think? Yeah.
Is it reflecting on the number of children who left Crimea, or is it reflected on people who are of senior age who say, it's my homeland, I'm going to stay here, I'm going to die here, contrasting to the people who have their whole life of them ahead of them and then moving on from Crimea?
Yeah, I'll address that second question first. I think that reflects, that relatively young age reflects particularly the number of students who have left, and those younger generations, particularly with the Crimean Tatars, who have a stronger attachment to Ukraine vis-a-vis Crimea, because many of them were born or raised in a Ukrainian Crimea and feel a stronger sense of affinity to the rest of the state and to mainland Ukraine. And it is true that many of the older generations of Crimean Tatars are more hesitant to leave Crimea, especially if they have older grandparents or the older generation to take care of. But there is a real sense that we fought for so long to come back to Crimea, and we're not going to leave it now. We're not going to give up now. And so some have found it possible to stay for one reason or another. But by and large, it is younger people, it is students who have left, and that I think is one indication of why that age is quite young.
I also heard about many stories about like men staying there and sending their wives with kids away from trouble.
Yeah, I think
Did you find that to be?
I've heard some stories of that. I didn't see it a whole lot. I think I've seen more families who have come together. Those who have families still there, it's usually their parents that they still connected to, but usually families have seemed to stay together. To the question of why they've chosen to go to certain places, it's true that Kherson is sort of the third most common destination just because it's so close. Crimea SOS has an office in Kherson to serve those who just come across the border and need to update their Ukrainian documents or whatever and come back, but many do just settle there. Kiev being the capital, being the center of the national, cultural, social, political movements, that is a big draw, and it's seen as being the place with the most opportunities. But Lviv is probably the most interesting one, I think. And one narrative I heard over and over was that, well, Lviv is very close to Europe, is very close to the rest of Europe, and if the situation should worsen, if Russia should make another push and we have to leave further, we're well positioned to make the jump across the border and further onto Europe if that's possible. There's also a real sense of romanticism tied up with Lviv, especially for the younger generation. I heard many people saying, oh, I'd always wanted to visit Lviv. It's this heart of Ukrainian culture now, as it's seen by many nowadays. And there was, I think that influenced the decision to move there for a lot of the younger people in particular. So some different reasons going on there.
Could you say something about the Russian-Ukrainian relationship now in Crimea of the remaining people, of those who remain? That's one. And the second one, I saw a real jumping graph there about religious belief, but I didn't see whether it was which group of...
That was Crimean Tatars. Yeah, even though many, especially younger ones, Crimean Tatars are quite secular, I would say, in their day-to-day lives, there is still a sense that we are Muslim. This is an essential part of our Crimean Tatar national identity, and so in a question like that in a survey, they tend to answer high for that.
That was of the, regardless of where they live now, I missed that graph.
That was just within the mainland of Ukraine, those who have left. Yeah, and so the first part was about those who have stayed?
Yes, stayed, the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians, of those who have stayed.
Okay, between ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians. I can't comment directly, having not been there recently to do the work, but by and large, those who have stayed are those who either support the annexation or who are willing to sort of turn a blind eye and keep their heads down and get on with their lives there, even if they do support Ukraine, as many do silently, because it's now very dangerous to voice political opposition to the occupation there. So I'd say the relationship is probably still fine. There's still the assumption that if you're still there, that you're on board with Russia being, occupying, or not, as I don't see it as occupying, but reincorporating Crimea. So I don't think there's any real sense of inter-ethnic conflict between Ukrainians and Russians. I think there may be more of a sense of discrimination or apprehension about Crimean Tatars among the very pro-Russian segments of the Crimean population, though.
My question for Crimea in particular, seemed to me that there was a larger percentage of Russian military retirees, Russian military network families than elsewhere in Ukraine, and I wonder how that impacts, some of the observations that have been made even generally here. How does that factor into this?
That's a very good point. That actually came up a lot among the people I spoke with. That said, one of the reasons it's so pro-Russian is that there are so many retirees, and that it's really a sense of being pro-Soviet, that it's nostalgia for the Soviet Union that drives a lot of these pro-Russian views. And a big part of that is because so many, or at least a relatively disproportionately large percentage of the population have those direct connections to the Soviet and/or Russian military, and that have reason to look through even rosier tinted glasses than others at the Soviet Union. And I think that does play a big role, both in what drove this sense of Crimea being so pro-Russian, and which emboldened Putin to go in the first place and annex it, but also in creating a disparity between those who have decided to stay and those who have decided to leave. I heard lots of people complaining like, they're all just complaining a lot about the people from Crimea that they can't stand to be around now. All these Russian chauvinists, the vatniki is the term they're around, the cottonheads basically. They miss the Soviet Union. They want to go back to the Soviet Union, and they look to Moscow and how prosperous it is, and they think, oh, we're going to be like that, not realizing that joining Russia is no antidote for some of the social and economic issues they've had. Yeah.
When you spoke to the IDPs, the prevalent language among those Crimean Tatars, was it Russian or Ukrainian?
Virtually every Crimean Tatar speaks Russian, and they do so amongst themselves more than any other language. The older generation might speak Crimean Tatar more. Younger generations, I think, are making a more concerted effort to use both Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian, in fact. The younger generation especially is totally fluent in Ukrainian. They grew up learning Ukrainian in schools. I do see them making more of an effort to use Ukrainian, but the default language is still Russian for many Crimeans as a whole, and Crimean Tatars particularly, which is pretty fascinating to think about. They view Russia as this historical nemesis, this antagonizer, the group that has displaced them from their homeland on multiple occasions, but because of their historical experience within the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, they've still become rather Russified, at least linguistically, and it's still hard to shake that sort of imperialist legacy.
Just quickly, one more about, I know the collapse of tourism, but is there anything more behind the economic decline of or the cost to Russia of Crimea, because it is now really a burden on Russia rather than...
Yeah. Well, there's the sanctions are still a big issue. Sanctions on Russia as a whole and on Crimea specifically, yeah. Yeah, there's separate sanctions, so it's even more difficult. You can't use certain credit cards and you can't access certain things in Crimea specifically now. It's become very difficult for many, yeah.
I just had one quick question, and I'm not really sure on the timing, so excuse me if it's not appropriate. Sure. But given all reports of the inability or the lack of motivation of the Russian Federation for maintaining the social safety net and social service payments, particularly pensions. Did this lack of social services after the Russian annexation come up in your interviews? Is this a salient point, particularly given the age differentials and the idea that the older population stays behind? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it came up more in reference to people referring to those who stayed behind, their parents or grandparents who, in many cases, are pro-Russian. There's a split generationally among many. Those who, parents are pro-Russian, children are pro-Ukrainian. It's caused real familial rifts. That's a whole other issue. But there have been those who said, oh yeah, my aunt is a doctor, a nurse, and so her salary has risen, and also, my retired grandfather has seen pensions actually going up. They have been able to pay out higher pensions and higher salaries to state employees in Crimea, and so that is a motivating factor for, I think, some to stay there, especially retirees. But
the prices go up too.
But the prices go up too. That's another issue that they complain about that. So even though some might be getting more from the state, that it doesn't afford them the same purchasing power that it might have if the situation were different.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, dear colleagues, first of all, let's please give Austin one more round of applause. I think we've been having an amazing conference. The time flew by. It is already 5 o'clock. I'm not sure how much energy the remaining people have left. If there are still a few questions remaining to the general panel, the speakers are willing to entertain them, but probably a very brief general Q&A. If not, again, a reminder that we can have an opportunity for an informal socializing at the Oriat after 6 p.m., but please let know. Chad has a sheet at the front desk because we need to notify the Oriat how many people will be joining so that we have the proper amount of seating available. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank first and foremost CREES's outstanding staff, to thank Bart, Chad, and Lisa for the terrific job that they do. We could not do even a tiny fraction. We will be able to do zilch without the great contributions that they have been making, and I tip my virtual hat in admiration to you. And I also invite all of those, I also like to thank our co-sponsors here on campus. I also would like to encourage everyone present to think about possible topics for future conferences. This is the 8th, and we want this tradition to continue in a robust fashion. And certainly this is one of the events that puts us on the national and global map. So let's continue this tradition in a wonderful, robust, and dignified way. So one more round of applause to all of us here and all of you. Thank you so much.